Jody Hardesty with Empowered Heart Connections. When we've experienced relationships in the past that have been high conflict, or we have past trauma from childhood, or we have a history of traumatic experiences in our lives, sometimes it can make us hardwired to be searching for that adrenaline rush. And often we don't even realize we're doing it. This is why sometimes whenever people are dating, they're looking for Mr. or Mrs. Excitement and maybe high conflict rather than somebody who is boring, who doesn't have that intensity, who doesn't have that volatility, who is unable to really create that kind of game playing environment or is not manipulative. Those things, although in logical land, right, we go, I don't want that. But when we've experienced a lot of trauma or stress in our past, we begin to associate that with our love and connection. And we also are kind of longing for that adrenaline rush to be recreated in each relationship that we're in. So sometimes I see people sabotaging relationships whenever they are maybe not a bad relationship, but they just don't really know how to handle a relationship that's not high stress. So for example, when someone is dating someone and they're not very interesting, or they're not exciting, or they're not creating enough dynamic in the relationship, it might be time to reevaluate what it is exactly that you're looking for and what it is about that adrenaline rush that keeps you kind of coming back for more. Most likely you've been in relationships in the past where you have had that adrenaline rush and eventually the relationship blows up because too much of that adrenaline rush in a relationship, too much of that conflict can lead to disconnect and high levels of dysfunction. So when you're looking for that adrenaline rush, evaluate, okay, what is it that is positive adrenaline? What can give me that kind of rush of excitement in a way that would be productive for me? And what can give me that rush of excitement that might produce more cortisol, stress hormones, and create more of a kind of detrimental pattern? So if we can add to our lives some things that enhance our ability to have that excitement, like going for a bike ride or going for a run, doing something active, or performing on stage, doing something that creates that adrenaline rush for you in a positive way, rather than trying to evoke that in a relationship. So sometimes this looks like maybe your relationship is going a little too smoothly and you're a little bored, so maybe you kind of play some games. Maybe you don't respond to texts or phone calls, or perhaps you maybe see a conflict where there isn't a conflict. So you're kind of escalating things whenever there's not really a need for that. Maybe they show up later than they normally do, and rather than saying, hey, what's up? What's happening, you automatically jump to a negative conclusion that, they're cheating on you, or they're doing something wrong, or it's time to fight. And so your instinct is to have a high conflict interaction where you're attacking or you're antagonizing maybe more than you recognize, and you're creating that adrenaline rush again in that dynamic where it may not be necessary. So other tactics are kind of withholding affection or withholding maybe even a connection to the other person. You know that they really appreciate it whenever you call them before you go to bed at night, and you start to withhold that over time whenever things start going a little too smoothly in the relationship. So these are some things that people are doing that can contribute to that continued escalation of that adrenaline-seeking kind of behaviors. So this is more common than I think people recognize, but it's really that habit that your body has gotten into, that habit of this is what I've associated with a loving relationship. And particularly for people who have been in a high conflict relationship as a child with one of their parents or both of their parents, they have learned over time that love in relationships equals high stress, equals adrenaline rush, equals maybe heart pounding, maybe unpredictability. And so by replicating that in your current relationships, you're recreating those kind of traumatic events. And again, most people aren't consciously doing this. It's not like, I think I'm going to cause some conflict in this relationship. They're unintentionally creating conflict where there isn't conflict, again, because that's familiar, it's comfortably uncomfortable. And what we get familiar with, we tend to replicate in our lives. So to be really aware of how much conflict you are creating and instigating in a relationship. And it's really challenging. It takes a lot of soul searching to kind of unravel this, because people who are recreating adrenaline in their relationships often feel like it's not their fault. They feel like, oh, well, the other person is instigating this, right? Well, they were late, for the date, and therefore they're picking on me, and therefore I have justification to attack them or snap at them or escalate the situation. So evaluating what your perception is can be really challenging. Is where is my part in the continued conflict in this dynamic? Am I creating problems where there may not be problems? Am I potentially seeing myself as a victim in a situation when I'm not necessarily a victim in those situations? Are you interpreting conversations in a way that are the most negative? For example, sometimes people will come back to a conversation that they had with their partners and take it out of context. So say they had a pretty reasonable conversation, but taken out of context, the person who is seeking that adrenaline is maybe sensing that there was some other translation, or they're interpreting it in a way that can create the sense of feeling like they've been victimized again. And again, I know this is really hard because most people don't intend to do this. We're not consciously going, hey, I'm going to cause some conflict in the relationship. But it becomes so hardwired that it is really difficult to unlock. And this is why it's so important, if you're continuing to have relationships that have high conflict, to really evaluate your peace. And again, sometimes obviously it's not people's fault. Some people are just having relationships with people who are conflictual and are negative and aren't really beneficial for them. However, I do find that the more we do our own work and evaluate what our part is, how am I contributing to the dysfunction of these relationships? How am I seeking adrenaline in relationships? And what am I looking for in a partner that might be sabotaging myself, right? So sometimes this may be not that you're even contributing necessarily as much to the adrenaline rush, but that the only people you're attracted to are people who have high conflicts, or people who are ready to go, are they're kind of volatile, or they also may have a history of trauma or high conflict and are pretty quick to be escalated. So these people, this is where it's tricky, because people are looking for a bad boy or a bad girl, somebody who's interesting, but you want to be looking for somebody who has your same value systems. So if you're really struggling and repeating patterns in relationships when you're dating someone, or even if you've been with somebody for a long time and you're having conflict over things that aren't really necessarily reasons for conflict, like you're fighting over toothpaste or something really benign, that it might be time to do a little soul searching and evaluate, what is it that I'm really fighting about? What is it that is causing these escalations? And is there something that's maybe behind this or underneath this that may be contributing to my interpretation of what this conflict is coming from? So again, if you are repeating these relationships, if you're having one adrenaline rush relationship after another, if you are in a relationship where you are continually having escalation with someone who maybe isn't really all that escalated, these are some really good clues that perhaps there's some past struggles that you may benefit from exploring and really evaluating. What is it that I want, and what does peacefulness look like in a relationship? How can I bring peace into my life? What would it look like, again, to have excitement separate from that adrenaline kind of traumatic, high conflict situation? And what does it feel like for you to sit quietly at peace? And are you able to allow yourself to settle in a peaceful state, or are you constantly looking for something that's activating in your life? And no matter what area it is, maybe even with friendships, things are pretty high conflict. So these are some really good clues, again, to do that soul searching and do a little digging. And it might be helpful if you are finding that this is maybe sounding familiar to you. It may be time to get a little counseling or some coaching to really help you evaluate what that those triggers are and what's keeping you stuck kind of replicating that traumatic event, because I can assure you it's so much more peaceful whenever you let go of the desire to have the conflict and the comfortably uncomfortable and are looking forward to moving into a more peaceful state, a more peaceful relationship, a more peaceful dynamic for your life, and it is possible. So again, I know it's painful to do a little soul searching. I know it's hard. I've done my own soul searching and recognized things about myself that I wasn't a big fan of. But we all have those things, and it's okay to do the work to really look at yourself and go, okay, how can I get out of my own way and make these roadblocks less significant? It's doable. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you so much for watching.